Today we're commemorating the 50th anniversary of Elliot Asanoff's landmark book on the 1919 World Series. My name is Jacob Pomrenke. I'm the chairman of SABR's Black Sox Scandal Research Committee. Now you might be wondering, what more is there to actually research about the Black Sox scandal all these years later? 8 Men Out first came out in 1963, and most people still consider it to be the definitive account of the Black Sox scandal. And it certainly is a very compelling and dramatic narrative that many baseball fans have read, millions over the years. And there's a good reason the book's popularity remains as high as it does today. But the truth is, as the late author Gene Carney liked to say, the Black Sox scandal is only a cold case, not a closed case. We're actually learning something new about the scandal, about the story, all the time. But before we talk more about that, I'd like to introduce our very special guest today. Over on the end is Bill Lamb. He's the author of a groundbreaking book, Black Sox in the Courtroom, the Grand Jury, Criminal Trial, and Civil Litigation, which was published by McFarland earlier this spring. His book is the first comprehensive account of all the various legal proceedings involved in the Black Sox scandal. That's both grand juries, yes, there were 2 of them, the famous criminal trial, and all the back pay lawsuits that were filed years later by the White Sox players. Bill was also the guest editor for a special Black Sox edition of McFarland's Baseball, a Journal of the Early Game in the spring of 2012. Bill is a retired New Jersey prosecutor who spent more than 3 decades in the courtroom. He now lives in Meredith, New Hampshire. Please welcome Bill Lamb. Next to him is Dr. David Fletcher. He's the founder and president of the Chicago Baseball Museum. A native Chicagoan, David is an occupational medicine specialist and co-founder of SafeWorks Illinois, a private medical practice which he operates in downstate Illinois. He's also a big White Sox fan who got married at the site of home plate of the old Comiskey Park, the original. And he's been studying and writing about the 1919 World Series for many years now. In 2005, he was the recipient of the Hilda Award from the Baseball Reliquary, which honors baseball fans and their importance to the game. Please welcome David Fletcher. And I have the distinct honor today of welcoming Patricia Anderson. Pat is the niece and surrogate daughter of Buck and Helen Weaver. Pat and her sister, the late Betty Scanlon, were raised by the Weavers on the south side of Chicago for 16 years after their father passed away in 1931. At 86, Pat now lives in Branson, Missouri, and she's devoted to clearing her beloved uncle's name. Pat helped David Fletcher launch a website called clearbuck.com at the 2003 MLB All-Star Game hosted by the White Sox in Chicago. Please welcome Pat Anderson. So it's been 50 years since 8 Men Out was first published. Baseball fans have been captivated by Elliot Asanoff's compelling story about the talented and disgruntled White Sox players who were underpaid and ill-treated by their owner, Charles Comiskey, and who took bribes from gamblers to fix the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. 8 Men Out has been called by Sports Illustrated as one of the top sports books of all time. So my first question to all the panelists is, when did you first read the book 8 Men Out, and how did it help you get interested in learning about the Black Sox scandal? Bill?
As best I can recall, I first read it about a year or 2 after it came out, which would be around 64 or 65. And at the time, I simply took it as the definitive account of the Black Sox affair. This is what happened. And I didn't change that view for probably 40-something years until I started doing independent research on my own as a consequence of having attended the very first meeting of this committee and joining the Black Sox investigatory panels. And so I no longer hold that view.
David?
Well, I have a Chicago connection, a White Sox connection, so I can recall reading it in the late 60s when I was 8th grade in high school, back in some dark days for the White Sox. So that's when I first recall, and I obviously, just like Bill, thought it was the gospel. You know, unfortunately, we've learned so many things, and I got to spend a lot of time with Elliot at his house, and you know, got a little bit more insight to his research, or lack of research, and obviously there's all this interest in still chasing this very fascinating story, you know, the Black Sox scandals forever.
David, one of the things that we've learned about the Black Sox scandal, and especially in the past decade, is, like you said, Elliot Asanoff's lack of research. He was able to interview some of the players, but he didn't really get a whole lot out of them, and he used some incomplete newspaper reports, but not much else. We've had a lot of new information about the Black Sox scandal come out in the last 10 years. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
As far as what's happened in the last 10 years, I think you know, SABR is really responsible for that. You know, about 10 years ago, when I was interested in you know, trying to help Pat clear her uncle's name, is when I really got interested in this story, and that's when Gene Carney, late Gene Carney, got started. And the first thing we did that really changed our eyes is Gene and I went up to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and saw the 1924 transcripts and all the trial exhibits that are held by the grandson of Ray Cannon. And that was kind of the first of many revelations that the story was different. And over that summer of 2003, we did the clearbuck.com rally at the U.S. Cellular during the All-Star game, which was to bring attention to you know, Buck Weaver's plight in the most visible place for MLB. And just more and more stuff came out, and it was this organization helped foster that. It was sort of a lot of fun to try to find some new tidbit or some new piece of the puzzle. For instance, Collier's Eye publication, which was something that Elliot had never even heard of or aware of, was something we all lusted to get after as scholars. And we looked and looked, and it's kind of strange, but it turned up that the last copies of Collier's Eye and the Planet were a mile from my office in Champaign at the Stacks at the University of Illinois. And so that was kind of exciting finding that out, because Collier's Eye, Bert Collier, he basically named names right after the World Series, and basically if it had been investigated following his leads, it would have not been in the cover-up. So it was just a lot of things like that. And we had a great summer, and Gene and I went out to New York, spent the whole day with Elliot, and we just quizzed him, and asked him various different aspects. What about Harry's diary? Did you ever see that? And just got an idea about his research. And it was obviously not as thorough, and certainly I admire Elliot, but it was certainly disappointing. A lot of material that was available he failed to pursue, or other people he could have interviewed.
One of the things that we've learned a lot about that was not included in 8 Men Out was the players' lives after the scandal, after they were banned from Major League Baseball in 1921. They went on to play outlaw games, semi-pro games all across the country, and then fanned out across the country and you know, lived their lives. And Pat is here to tell us a little bit about that. What was life? She was raised by Buck and Helen Weaver from the age of 4 after her father passed away in 1931. What was life like with your Uncle Buck?
Well, it was great. He was a man he instilled in you very good ideas. He never believed in anything. I mean, he never told any untrue stories, although that would be impossible for me to prove, but this is what I heard. He never said anything to, like put his part, code it and, you know, make it sound better than what it was, but he was very truthful, but he never would lie about anything. I mean, it's not, I know people say, oh, well, everybody lies sometimes. Baseball was Buck's life. He could not lie about that. To him, if he could have been playing baseball, been reinstated, it would have been the most wonderful thing in the world. And he always had a smile on his face. I don't know if any of you remember pictures of him. In almost every picture you had ever seen of him, he had that grin on his face. He was taking it on the chin, so to speak, but he believed in himself, and many of his fans and many of his relatives and friends believed in him too. He wanted so desperately to play baseball. To him, the most wonderful thing in his life would have been if they reinstated him so he could get back into play. He played ball, you know, what did they call it? The, what was it? Semi-pro, thank you, Doc. The semi-pro ball. And they said he was out there just scampering around like a kid, and he was in his 30s then. And, well, that's not so old, and doesn't sound old to me at all. But he kept playing into his 40s, and a few of the fellas that played with him on those teams, a couple of them got to be pretty good ball players afterwards, and they said he could swing around there and scatter and catch. They said they didn't know how he did it at his age, but he loved it. He loved it, he lived it, and he fought until the day he died.
He had a lot of friends in baseball, too. Some of his
Oh.
old teammates, Ray Schalk and Red Faber,
Yeah.
and they
You
all
know,
defended him and were
To
friends with
me, the
him.
most unlikely friend he had was Ty Cobb, because he was known as to be a pretty rough player. And, well, he was, I don't know, I would say, I wouldn't use the word, you know, some of the words they used on him, but I'd say he was with stinker. He played rough, and they knew if he was going to come into their base, he came in with his spikes up. And he always sharpened his spikes, made sure he had. Of course, Buck did too, but he didn't come in with spikes after somebody. He just let them know he had them, and then they left him alone. But he would come in, and Buck finally told him, he said he wouldn't get off his base. And he said, you come in at me. And he said, I'm going to be there. And he said, I might be not standing on the base, but when you come sliding in, I'm going to be there to jump on you. He said, you're not going to take my base. And he said, if you want to talk about it, we'll talk about it later. And that was one time a friend of my sister's had said he had worked at the park, and he said he heard the two of them saying, all right, we'll meet afterwards under the stands. And Buck said, you bet. And the fellow said he and a few of the other guys that worked there decided, we got to sneak around and see what's going on. Well, the two of them fought like a couple of tigers. But Ty Cobb was over 200 pounds, and he was over 6 foot tall. Buck was 5'10", and he had 170. And he beat the tar out of him. And after that, Cobb couldn't say the nicest things about Buck. Buck was on his favorite team when he picked out his team for, you know, the all-star deal for him. Buck Weaver was always third base. He said he's the best third baseman I ever saw.
I know Ty Cobb named Buck Weaver to his all-time all-star team for many, many years in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He never failed to name Buck Weaver as his top third baseman of all time.
Yeah. Cobb was a tough man, but of course he was a marvelous player. But there was a lot of the men, a lot of the baseball players that were scared of him, because, I mean, he was rough, and he wouldn't pull any punches no matter what. But Buck stood up to him, and I think Cobb was the type that he admired that, and he didn't try to pull anything on Buck after that fight. He realized that he meant what he said. So I always admire my uncle for standing up for his ideas, and he third base was after shortstop, which he was very good at, but he was a fantastic third baseman, and they always said that he just guarded that territory like it was, you know, he was a tiger and he was going to take anybody out that just didn't give way. So I learned an awful lot from my uncle when we were raised, my sister and I. My sister Betty worked for the Sun-Times for many years, and she always worked hard at trying to get the different people or sports people interested in Buck, give him another chance, let's get something started for him. I was a little bit younger then, and I wasn't that much help. So, but when we would get anything going, then my cousin Marge Cook married Follett. She worked terribly hard for him, and she was fantastic at it. And we just had things going all the time. But every time we'd get such enthusiasm and thought, now they're going to pay attention. And they didn't. They didn't think it was anything. There was one, it wasn't Landis, who I will say less about, but I'm trying to remember, Doc, who was the next one after him?
Happy Chandler.
Chandler. Buck had wrote to him, and he had at that time he had a lawyer, and he got notice to him, and, you know, they wanted to have him bring it up or talk about it. And he wrote back and said, well, it's old news, nobody would be interested. I didn't like him either.
You said Buck was known for his enthusiasm. He was always smiling on the field, smiling off the field, smiling at home. What was the story about the 1917 World Series after they won the championship?
I forgot the name of the reporter that had recorded it, but he said when it was announced and they at that game and everybody was so thrilled the Sox won. They had the pennant clinched. And Bucks got out there. He threw his cap in the air, his 3 bats. 3 of the spectators were too close to him. He got their caps and he threw them in the air. He was dancing around the whole time. And then there was something else he grabbed, and they had to grab it and get it away from him. And then they calmed him down because he was just in seventh heaven, and of course all the fans just thought it was great because he would get out and do a lot of that type of thing at some games to get them worked up or get them excited. But he said he looked like a whirling dervish out there.
Jacob, if I could just jump in for a second about the 1917 World Series. I'm very proud to say Pat has 2 uncles who are world champions in that team.
Yeah.
Her other uncle was the pitcher, Jim Scott, and married your aunt.
Yeah. My mother and her sisters were in show business, and they were, well, originally the Cook sisters, and then the four-girl quartet and the American Girl quartet. And that's how Buck had met Helen. It was 1911 when they were touring, and he liked what he saw. So Helen was a beautiful woman, but she was in show business and on the road traveling from one town to the other when they did this, their acts on, what do you call it again?
Vaudeville?
Thank you, Doc. I forget these things sometimes. Vaudeville. They were in vaudeville for a long time. And then they'd meet here and there when he would be playing in certain towns. And he really did go for her. And she liked him a lot. But there was just something always going on. Well, then by 1914, they were talking marriage, and he was going on that world tour. They had the supposed Giants and White Sox going on this world tour for baseball. And there weren't that many of the original White Sox players or Giants that really wanted to go overseas. They were family people, or else they had girlfriends that kicked up an awful fuss and they couldn't leave all that time. So Buck had asked Helen to go, but our grandfather Cook said, no, you're not married, you're not going. And Buck agreed. He was always a diplomat. He said, when I get back. And when he did get back from his trip, It wasn't very much longer before that he got married. But the one interesting thing about that is outgoing Buck was. I mean, he was just, especially with baseball or anything that came up with it, he just, bubbled. He was all out. He was showing the public what they wanted. He loved talking to all of them. But when it came to his private life, he shut up. And nobody knew except the close family that he was going to get married. He didn't even tell his baseball buddies. That was private to him, and that was nobody's business but his. So my grandfather and grandmother Cook were their witnesses, and they went and got married. And after that, then he let everybody know, and then they had a good time. But not at the wedding. That was private.
Buck always had a lot of fans in Chicago. They were always starting petitions for him to get reinstated. Did you ever think we'd be sitting here nearly 100 years after he last played in the major leagues talking about him?
Oh, there were so many of growing up, it took me a long time. I didn't claim I was smart to realize just who my uncle was. I mean, to me, I thought he was wonderful, and I knew he played baseball, but heck, everybody played baseball, so some of them weren't so good. I mean, all the different empty lots around the areas were filled with baseball players. But when I finally realized who he was, I thought, oh, golly, I guess that's important. And I was impressed, but he just looked at me. I said one time to him, I said, gee, Uncle Buck, I didn't know who you really were. And he said, well, who am I? And he said, I think I'm your uncle. I said, oh, I know, but you were a baseball player. You were with the White Sox. He said, I know. In other words, he kind of squelched it. Don't make a big deal of it. That wasn't what he felt he was. He felt he was Buck Weaver. He loved to play baseball. Yes, you could say he was the premier third baseman, but he didn't go around bragging about that. He never, that I can ever remember hearing, that he bragged about himself. He didn't believe in it. If other people would tell him how good they thought he was or how much, they liked what he did, and he'd say, well, you were there at that game? Oh, yeah, we saw you do, whatever wonderful catch or play it was. And he made some spectacular ones, I understand. But he'd say, oh, glad you were there. Come again. I mean, he never, said, oh, well, of course, he didn't tout his own, he didn't blow his own whistle, I guess you say. And, but he liked people. When people wanted to meet him, and like when I used to walk to work with him sometimes, he'd come along and they'd say, hi, Buck. He could be a man, a boy, a woman, or a grandmother. They knew him in the area because he stayed there and lived all his life. And they'd, hi, Buck. Hi, kid. Everybody was, hi, kid. Didn't make any difference how old they were or what they were. It was, hi, kid. So I said to him one time, Uncle Buck, you always say, hi, kid, to everybody. But I said, they're not all kids. He said, I know that, but he said, when they say hello to me, I'm going to answer them because they're nice enough to remember me. So it's easiest to say, hi, kid. So I understood.
I want to shift focus a little bit toward 8 Men Out and the Black Sox scandal. Bill, your new book, Black Sox in the Courtroom, which just came out this spring, it covers a subject that was barely mentioned in 8 Men Out with all the legal proceedings, and it's mostly been ignored for the last 90 years, really. How do you think the newfound attention and knowledge on the legal proceedings kind of adds to our understanding of the whole Black Sox story?
Well, I'm hopeful that it will give us a more historically reliable picture of what actually took place. I'm an admirer of the Asimov book. I think it's very well written, it's very entertaining, but it's not reliable history. It has all the devices of historical fiction, invented dialogue, imaginary characters, and frankly, manufactured events. And in terms of its accuracy, preparing for the panel, I reread the book, and even without trying to be a nitpicker, I found 81 things, as a matter of fact, that I believe to be historically incorrect. So if your platform of knowledge is built upon 8 Men Out, and you stop there, you'll have a view of the scandal that I think is significantly outdated. I think there's a lot of new material, particularly some of the material that David mentioned, the new archives that are available to the public at the Chicago History Museum, and hopefully you'll read my book, and you'll have a different perspective on the affair. I tried hard to be neutral, but I think the facts will portray the scandal in a different light than you'd get from reading 8 Men Out.
One of the things that we, I think all three of us agree is inaccurate, and there's a story about it in today's Wall Street Journal, in which Bill and David are both quoted, about a auction house that's offering $1 million reward if anyone can produce the signed confessions of Shoeless Joe Jackson and Eddie Seacott and Lefty Williams. This was such a dramatic scene in 8 Men Out, both the book and the film, when the confessions were stolen and everyone, the prosecutors at trial, didn't know where they were. But Bill, in your book, you made it pretty clear that the confessions were not missing for very long, were they?
That whole thing is a myth. What you have is two different items. One are statements taken in the office of Alfred Austrian, the corporate counsel for the White Sox, before the players were called to the grand jury, in which they admitted their complicity. That's Eddie Seacott, Joe Jackson, and a day later, Lefty Williams. Those statements were transcribed and now are available on the internet. You can look them up this afternoon if you like. Thereafter, those players were taken to the grand jury, where their testimony was taken down, and in which they admitted that they had agreed to accept money in exchange for throwing the series. In the 1920s, before you had modern recording devices, grand jury testimony was taken down by a shorthand reporter, taking notes. Thereafter, as time and circumstance permit, the shorthand reporter would transcribe his notes into a typed transcript, which would then be sent to the prosecutor's office, in this case, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, for safekeeping. At some point after the original indictments were returned, those transcriptions were stolen, and it got a lot of play. And to this day, people think that the prosecution foundered on the facts that the confessions, quote unquote, of the three players were stolen and never available. It's not historically true. As soon as the state's attorney's office discovered that the transcripts were missing, they merely called in the two reporters, Elbert Allen and Walter Smith, and had them redo the transcript. The transcript was admitted in evidence at the trial, was read at stupefying length during the proceedings, but had been redacted, which means that the names of particular defendants were removed. Instead of hearing Eddie Seacott did this or Joe Jackson did that, you'd hear Mr. Blank did this or Mr. Blank did that. And in the atmosphere of the courthouse, which was stifling hot, the juries were, I can speak from experience, reading transcripts to jury, death. You will not keep them awake for 5 minutes. I'm sure they were out like a light, and it had no effect, or certainly not the effect that the prosecutors intended. But the whole notion that there are confessions somewhere out there missing, first, they're not confessions, they're grand jury transcripts, and two, they're not missing, and they haven't been missing since early 1921.
David, 8 Men Out was published 50 years ago, but as Bill said, we have a lot of new information. What are your thoughts 50 years later on 8 Men Out's legacy and how we should perceive the book now?
Well, I think it's it's certainly a seminal work, but I think as an organization, SABR is we want to get the most accurate picture of history. And I think Bill's comments are really right on target. I mean, there's just lots and lots of glaring errors. And when I met with Elliot several times, when he was somewhat threatened because of the knowledge base Gene and I had, and when I first talked to him about my plan to redo his book with all the light of information, provide a global overview, he was somewhat threatened about it and just discouraged me. It's still a great work. Unfortunately, it's cast a lot of characters over the years, as Comiskey as the skinflint, as the villain, and it doesn't really tell the true story, and it misses a lot of facts. And it's still a great work, and it obviously has sparked a lot of interest, and it's a great baseball story, but it's not the final picture. And I give a plug for Bill's book. It's an outstanding book. It really tells very accurately, historically, all the various different legal saga. And I'll put one point as far as some new information that goes with the trials. As part of my research this last decade, I had the pleasure of meeting Judge Friend's daughter, and how I got to meet her was I gave a talk at a shorthand court reporters group about this trial, and how the stenographer Allen was called to testify in the 24 trial, and he had the quote missing confessions, the grand jury testimony. It was kept in a safe, and he just basically retyped from his shorthand notes. So I gave this talk, and some woman came up to me and says, "You need to meet my mother. She's Hugo Friend's daughter." So I did, and the name was very familiar. The name was Cindy Pritzker. And I go, "That's a pretty famous name in Chicago." Well, it turned out, Cindy Pritzker, one of the biggest philanthropists, Hugo Friend was her dad. And I got to go to her penthouse apartment by the Drake, right there, Oak Street Beach in Chicago, if you're familiar with that, and go up to her house. And I had the pleasure, I took lots of pictures of his scrapbook. It was phenomenal. And his own insights to the trial. And if you recall, one of Elliot's main references in personal interviews, because he didn't interview her or didn't interview Betty Scanlon, who worked for the Sun-Times, her older sister, but Elliot did spend a lot of time with Hugo Friend right before he died. And he was kind of the big reference in the legal stuff. And I asked Elliot, "How come you didn't go up to Milwaukee?" "I just didn't have time." And even though that Hugo Friend had recommended he go up there and look at those transcripts, which have been very, very helpful for his book. But the Hugo Friend stuff, which I'll have to write some stuff sometime about that, is just phenomenal. And that was his first trial. And Comiskey was so happy with the verdict, he gave Hugo Friend a lifetime pass to Comiskey Park.
For reference, Hugo Friend was the presiding judge over the criminal trial in 1921, where the Black Sox were acquitted, but then they were banned one day later by Judge Landis. We don't have a whole lot of time left before the awards luncheon, so I want to open it up for questions here. If you could use the mic here in front. And one thing I do want to point out is our SABR Black Sox Scandal Research Committee is always looking into all this information. And Bill's book was helped a lot by members of the committee. And, there's all kinds of new information out there, especially at the Chicago History Museum. And in fact, there are a lot of different sources of information. I was over at the Penn Rare Books Library here in Philadelphia earlier this week, looking at the uncatalogued papers of James T. Farrell, the Chicago writer who was friends with Buck Weaver in the 50s. So there's all kinds of sources that Elliot Asanoff did not have access to when he wrote his book that we can use now to expand our knowledge of the story. So, first question.
Hi, I'm Norm King from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Hi, Bill. I'd just like to ask you, ma'am, how did your uncle earn his living once he was no longer able to play baseball?
Well, he invested in my father. My father was a pharmacist. He had originally worked for Charles Walgreen, and when he left him, he started some of his own drugstores. And Buck decided that Bill, my dad, was a pretty good businessman, and Buck was no slouch. He was very sharp. So they went together, and they had, before Depression hit, they had 6 drugstores going. And they were both very good men at what they did. Dad was a fantastic pharmacist. Buck was a good businessman. And Walgreen wanted them to go into junior partnership with him because he knew how well they were doing, and they would be a good interest. And they sometimes my family hasn't made the best solutions, but they decided that no, they were going to stay on their own. They liked working together. They liked having their stores. They didn't have any advanced information that Depression was going to hit. So when it hit, they lost everything but one store. Dad was able to hang on to the one store, and he and Buck kept the one drugstore going. But then Dad should, knowing a pharmacist, and he knew a lot about, as far as the part of being almost a doctor, knowing all that information, he had these attacks and never went to have it checked out because he thought, well, I'll be all right, I can manage. And he was having appendicitis attacks. And he suddenly had bursted appendix. And they rushed him to the hospital. And if it was a year later, if that had happened, penicillin was developed then. But he was too soon. And so with a week of laying suffering and having blood changed and constantly like that, he died. So Uncle Buck decided that he gave my mother and sister and I a home. We were all together anyway, and we deserved to live together. And they had been very close, he and my uncle. So that was how that happened with that.
So your uncle continued in some kind of business?
In that business, he also had a, I think,
Flower shop.
yeah, flower shop, wasn't it?
Flower shop.
Yeah, and they also, I don't know if I should even mention it, they tried to have a restaurant going with, Buck Weaver's, and he had the cards for it and everything, but they didn't know how to manage food right. They evidently gave too generous portions on these ribs and things like that, so they didn't make a go of it. It didn't last more than a year. But it was, Helen and Buck thought, well, they'd have that going, but that fell through.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
I have a quick comment and a quick question. David Kaiser from Watertown. I haven't read your book. I do want to say that, again, this question comes up, what could we possibly learn that was new after all this time? And I'm terribly sad that Gene Carney passed away, because that book was just a fantastic piece of reconstruction 8 or 9 years after the fact. But my question has to do with another document. And the last time I asked this, a few years ago, in another SABR meeting, nobody knew the answer. And that is, where's the Gravener diary?
I'm sorry?
Where's the Gravener
I don't know.
diary? Nobody knows. Okay, thank you.
As far as Harry's diary, we did a piece of the Baseball Museum website. I've actually got to know the person who discovered it, Fred Kriebel, and he doesn't know where it's at. And when he asked Elliot did see it. He saw it, if you remember, ESPN did that special back in 2001, 2002, and he saw a typed version of it. And I asked him, well, didn't you keep a copy? And he said the producer didn't give it back to him. That was, Gina and I were quite upset, because that, to me, that's, when I told, Wall Street Journal interviewed me and my colleagues here, I said, those confessions don't exist, they're not going to get a reward, but Harry's diary would be to me, is the holy grail still out there of Black Sox, and it's sad it was never copied and so forth, so I think that's the document, so.
Hi, I have two questions. David Spiegler from New York. I have two questions, one about Buck Weaver and one about Shoeless Joe Jackson. On the Buck Weaver side, there's, we see this in the PED era today, where there's rush to judgment. Everything's black and white. You're either guilty or you're not, and whatnot. But the truth is, there can be varying degrees on the Shoeless Joe Jackson side as well as the Buck Weaver side. The question is, I've heard arguments with Buck Weaver that he was really, I've heard some people argue he was really involved in going through or plays in the field, and saying he was really more involved than people say. I've heard other people, kind of the more conventional approach, saying no, he knew about it, but he didn't participate, and he didn't take part, and he didn't endorse it. And then I've heard others saying he knew even less than that. And so I guess with the Free Buck Weaver movement, the question is, where's the central argument? Is it that he knew about it but didn't participate, so certainly almost 100 years he served his time, or is it he knew less than we thought we did, than it was thought at the time, and the crime wasn't really justified? On the Joe Jackson side, from what I've seen, clearly he took money. I think that's fairly well agreed, but there's a lot of debate there about how much he participated in. So I'm curious about what we know now as opposed to what was an 8-man out. What is the opinion of the panel in terms of the relative degree of guilt on his side as well?
I think the biggest thing is that Buck Weaver certainly knew about the fix, but so did everyone else. And, I mean, there was nobody that he could tell who didn't already know. Charles Comiskey was aware of the fix, as early as Game 1 of the World Series. In Bill's book, he's got a nice nugget from the grand jury testimony that the Chicago Cubs secretary, John Sayes, was the stakes holder for bets placed by Abe Attell, one of the gamblers fixing the World Series. So nobody who Buck could tell didn't already know. So yes, he had guilty knowledge, so did everyone else, and I think that's, what could he really do about it? And he said that all his life, who could he tell? Everyone already knew, and I think that's one of the things, we knew that all along, but we've really been able to confirm that in the last 10, 20 years.
Well, it's like the steroid situation right now. All the other players knew people were doing PEDs. How come they didn't come forward? No different than Buck Weaver. Right. Now, obviously I've researched this very well. Buck did participate in meetings. I know of at least 3 meetings he was involved in around the time of the fix of the first games. Obviously, he made a decision not to participate. His play on the field, says that. The only person I've ever seen a couple times refer to him as possibly playing was Eddie Collins. In Game 1, was a hit and run situation in the first inning. But there was really I don't think anybody else has given anything. He didn't leave it out in the field. In fact, the Cincinnati papers, after Game 8, when the Reds won, had incredible stories about how Buck Weaver was just the passionate player. He never gave up. So I think that his plays on the field, and no one has ever come out and said he's got money. So he's kind of got a mixed bag as far as, obviously he had some knowledge base, but he didn't participate. And so, and one of the things, just from a family situation, when John Cusack played Buck Weaver, her sister was kind of a consultant to help train him about his character, and then also Ron Santo was his third base instructor for John Cusack at Wrigley Field, of all places.
Okay, last question.
No, I want to address that point. And it is awkward for me, because I don't mean to give offense to Mrs. Anderson or hurt to the family, but I do not share the view that Buck Weaver was not a participant. I think there's a substantial body of evidence that he did more than just appear in meetings, which he admittedly did. Every Black Sox player who ever spoke publicly about the affair named him as a fixed participant. That includes Eddie Seacott, Lefty Williams, Joe Jackson, Chick Yandel, Bill Burns, Billy Maharg, inferentially Happy Felsch, and Harry Redmond. And again, to take issue on a matter of fact, there is in fact at least one, actually 2 witnesses who maintain that Buck Weaver was present in room 708 of the Sinton Hotel in Game 2 when money was distributed to the Sox after they lost Game 2. And that would be the civil deposition of Bill Burns, corroborated by the civil deposition of Billy Maharg for the Joe Jackson lawsuits. Now, I agree that there are relative degrees of guilt, that people like Jackson and Weaver, who may have gone along and, in Jackson's case, taken money, are not in the same class of villain, if you will, as Seacott and Gandil. But I think that there is a fairly significant body of evidence that should not be ignored in assessing the relative guilt of the people. And in my estimation, that includes Buck Weaver.
Thank you.
My name is Dave Lippman. I'm from Newark, New Jersey. I have a quick comment. My comment is that I want to apologize to Patricia on behalf of my great uncle, who was a bagman and enforcer for Arnold Rothstein. He carried some of the betting money and betting slips around, so I want to apologize to her on behalf of my family for the immense difficulty that my great uncle caused you. My question is for the whole panel. For Patricia, I would like to know what your uncle said, if anything, to the family about the 1919 incident, and to the panel, I would like to know how Elliot Asanoff took you folks, basically outlining to him all the manifold errors and missteps in his book.
My Uncle Buck never discussed the 1919 series to the family per se. my aunt knew what had gone on, and probably my mother and father knew more or less, but they didn't talk about it. It wasn't a subject that they brought up because they felt this was Buck's own personal deal, and they believed in him. And then he said he knew about it, but he told them he didn't want the money. He didn't believe that the games could be, lost. He thought all the players would play to win, and he believed that. Well, he got out there and played his life out, but the other players were gradually kind of going down, down, down. He knew then, and they said he played harder than ever. And he was shouting at all of them all the time. He was a great one for gabbing at all the players when he was on the field playing his part. And there was Jackson at the end. He was playing like he should. He was a marvelous player. He had wonderful stats. And he played up to what he could do. So he was scared. He didn't like the fact that they left him money because he changed his mind, but he didn't know who to go to. And of course, anybody that he talked to just said, go away. They didn't want anything to do with it either. So it was a really sad thing because it might have been able to be nipped in the bud if the right people had spoke up or talked about it.
Regarding Asimov, again, to repeat, when I read the book back in the mid-'60s, I accepted it, as most people did, as gospel, as many people do today. In going over the legal proceedings for the book, it became obvious to me that things that he described in the book either hadn't happened or hadn't happened the way he described them. And certain things that did happen escaped his notice. And so you can read Eight Men Out, and should read it, as a marvelous piece of entertainment, the same way you read Gore Vidal on United States history. It's entertaining, based on a true story, but it's not reliable historically. That's my opinion.
And I would agree with that. When Gene and I went to his house, he had told us that he had 50 hours of Abe Attell on tape up in his attic. And, we tried to get up and get some tapes. He wouldn't do it. When he died, I contacted his son and asked, where are the tapes? And I was one of the first people, when the Chicago History Museum got his papers, I wanted to listen to those tapes. They didn't exist. Also, Gene and I, we got out of him about the fictional characters, which he talked about in his 1979 book, Bleeding Between the Lines. And that's when we found out Harry F. was made up. That story about Lefty Williams being threatened was a complete fictional character he was advised to by his publisher. But he actually had a kind of a last laugh with that. He was so very miffed that he was not involved in Ken Burns' baseball series in 1994, and he was glad that the Ken Burns, they brought that thing up, and his fictional character lives forever. So he was very much challenged by Gene and myself because we were doing the gumshoe research. Another thing he talked about, he thought that that Redmond, the theater owner in St. Louis, was your relative, was Rothstein's brother. And that was a big thing he was trying to tell us. And we went back and checked it out, that Rothstein's brother actually died in 1919. It couldn't be. So,
And Harry Redmond was a virulent anti-Semite.
Yeah.
So, not likely to be Arnold Rothstein's brother.
yeah.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time here. Before we wrap up, I'd like to point out that anyone who's going to the awards luncheon in the room next door, it will begin promptly at noon.